Okay, let's get started. So welcome, my name is Lucia Knight and you are attending the Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences noon meeting that we're hosting, and I'm very pleased today to welcome Mamothena Mothupi to the session, who's going to be presenting for us. Mamothena is a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Public Health at the University of the Western Cape, who we work closely with. And Mamothena is presenting about a project that we have jointly been involved in around gender norms and adolescent health. And so I think it will be really interesting to hear her perspectives. She's working a lot around gender and health at the moment, and particularly is involved in the Gender and Health Hub of the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health. So for those of you that have seen some of the information that's been going around that Mamothena has been very involved in that in the last few months. But I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk, and I'm going to hand over to Mamothena. I hope that some other people will join us along the way and that we aren't affected by load shedding, but we'll have to see how that goes. So Mamothena, can I hand over to you, and welcome and thank you.
Oops. Right, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Lucia. Thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Mamothena, and as Lucia has already said, I'm in the School of Public Health at the University of the Western Cape. And the School of Public Health was one of the institutions that were implementing the global early adolescence study that was done in a few countries to investigate a few early adolescence issues, especially around gender norms and various health outcomes. So what I'll be presenting today is the comparative study between South Africa and Belgium that was looking at attitudes regarding gender diversity and sexual diversity among early adolescents in those two countries. So as I said, this was part of the bigger global early adolescent study, and if we will talk about gender norms quite a bit, so I thought I'd define it for us. It's regarded in this study as the set of rules for what's appropriately masculine and feminine behavior in a given culture. And individuals expect others to conform to these behaviors and tend to conform to them as well. So that's what we mean by gender norms in this study. And this study was done against this backdrop of gender inequalities that are prevalent all over the world and restrictive gender norms and how they affect people's health, especially with adolescents, adolescent pregnancy, gender-based violence, HIV prevention, contraceptive use, treatment access and adherence, among others. And the gender inequalities are often manifested in this stereotypical roles of masculinity and femininity and these hierarchical power relations where men would have a more superior position and women are supposed to be in a more inferior position. And that has implications for how people behave and how their health and health access is impacted. And also this context of gender inequalities and restrictive norms leads to this discrimination of the LGBTQI plus community and people because of these sanctions for non-conforming behaviors that fall outside of those norms that societies endorse. And early adolescence is a period of transitions, and young people are learning a lot, and what they learn and what they interact with has implications for their lifelong attitudes and norms as well, and therefore their health, their related health outcomes as well. And so we thought about in these two countries, what's the role of societal interventions in this transmission of gender norms, if you will. And we thought about frameworks, legal frameworks and policy frameworks, the laws that countries make to try to promote gender equality and enforce and prohibit discrimination. And would these progressive policies and legal frameworks foster this sort of progressive attitudes in those societies? And we wanted to use that as the context for comparing attitudes among young adolescents in Belgium and in South Africa, particularly towards gender norms themselves, but also sexual and gender diversity. This backdrop of progressive laws on anti-discrimination and gender equality. So just to give more comparison between Belgium and South Africa, there are a few laws that we reviewed to try to characterize the policy and legal frameworks that exist. Belgium has quite a few policies or legal frameworks rather on equality of men and women, prohibiting discrimination based on sex and sexual orientation, prohibiting discrimination based on gender identity or expression, legalization of same-sex marriage and same-sex adoption. South Africa, on the other hand, has some of the similar laws, similar prohibitions, additionally prohibitions explicitly on gender-based violence and other restrictive practices like female genital mutilation, for instance, are illegal. And there are even high court decisions around same-sex adoption, actually, which make it possible in the country. And other special laws like prohibiting discrimination of same-sex couples by officiators of marriage, for instance. So the contexts for these sort of legal frameworks are quite similar in both countries. So to compare the two groups of adolescents, we conducted a descriptive cross-sectional study, and they were early adolescents aged between 10 and 14. It's actually 10 and 15. And the settings were low-income urban communities in both countries. And the young adolescents, early adolescents, were sampled from clusters of schools targeting these particular communities. And for sample size, around 900 were needed. But in the South African context, because data was being collected between the period 2019 and 2020, only 569 young adolescents were recruited because the COVID pandemic then hit in early 2020. In Belgium, about 1,100 were recruited into the study. And data collection was done with tablets, with self-interviewing. Of course, the researchers, the data collectors, the researchers were also there to assist and help when needed. And the questionnaires were available in Dutch in Belgium and in local languages in South Africa. I believe it was Afrikaans, Xhosa, and English. And the data was collected 2018, 2019 in Belgium, and in South Africa, as I had stated, 2019, 2020 period. So for data analysis, we looked at frequencies and described frequencies for some socio-demographic variables, and we would compare boys and girls within the country and see if there were significant differences. We also did exploratory factor analysis for scales of gender norms and other variables around gender and sexual diversity. And I'm going to go into more detail about the gender norms scales just now. And then once the scales were confirmed, we then did a comparison between the genders and the countries by calculating the mean score for each scale and for each group and comparing that using Mamothena test. And then missing values were excluded from the analysis of the gender norm scale. Ethics were obtained from various institutions, both at UWC and Ghent University, and as well Johns Hopkins for the broader study. So for the gender norm scales, these are important because they form really part of the core of the findings for the study. So I thought we would go into more details with them, and these come out of the exploratory factor analysis. So there is a broader set of questions that were asked of the respondents, but when we do EFA, these are the ones that group together, and we characterize them, this way. So there were gender stereotypical traits which touch on attitudes about how boys and girls should express themselves. So how boys should be, for example, boys should be tough so that they can overcome difficulties. Girls should be humble. Boys should show that they are tough. And if a boy behaves like a girl, they're considered weak. So those are the stereotypical traits that we wanted to see how much the young adolescents, the early adolescents endorse or don't endorse by looking at the mean score of how much they agree or disagree with each statement across the different scales. The second scale was the gender stereotypical role scale. This is more about how people should act and what they should do, particularly in relationships, and it touches on, it's not just boys and girls, but men and women in general. And they have a few variables within the scale around women being in the more obedient role, and men being seen as providers, and also their attitudes towards sex as well being quite different from women. And then there were gender stereotypical physical appearances. There weren't that many variables. It actually was quite related to stereotypical traits, but because it's tied to how people should look, we made it its own category. And it's really more about describing for girls what they should look like. They should wear skirts, they should be interested in makeup, and so on. The next three scales were around romantic expectations of the early adolescents. And it's about the early adolescents and how they should behave in romantic relationship. And here it was more of an equalization of the standards regarding romance and pursuance of relationships. So a boy should be able to have a girlfriend if he wants to. A girl should be able to have a boyfriend if she wants to, and the degree to which young adolescents agreed or disagreed with these statements. Sexual double standards are about expected sexual behaviors, where the contrast between boys and girls was explored. So, for instance, if a girl has a boyfriend, she can be a victim of rumors. Boys play this more dominant role and determine the direction of the sexual relationships, if you will, because it talks about how adolescent boys fool girls into having sex, boys have girlfriends to show off to their friends, and girls should be in this more avoidant role where they avoid boys, and boys will lose interest in them after they have sex. So all these statements that show what the stereotypes are regarding men and women, boys and girls roles in society. And then regarding sexual diversity, we also assessed attitudes towards homosexuality and how people should behave. And so this is testing what young adolescents think about different stereotypes or opinions or attitudes, like gay people should not display romantic feelings in public, or homosexuality is given too much attention, and seeing what the mean scores are for this particular scale. So these are the 6 main scales that we assessed, but there were also a few more variables around gender diversity and sexual diversity that we will also look at in the findings. But the main scales, when I refer to the scales, these are the kinds of variables that I'll be referring to for each of the scales. So for the results for the sociodemographics, in South Africa, I mean, the mean age was 13 for all the countries. In South Africa, slightly more girls than boys attended, and the opposite was true for Belgium. And then we asked early adolescents how they feel about their own gender. So for instance, if it's a boy, we asked them how much like a quote unquote real boy someone feels. So majority of the boys felt, 90% of them, these are percentages, 90% of them felt like a real boy, and fewer of them had more diverse feelings about their own gender. Girls in South Africa, 80% of them felt like 100% like a real girl, and mostly like a real girl. The notable finding was in Belgium, where only about 60% of girls felt like a real girl, and they expressed 25% feeling mostly like a real girl, and 7% around 50%. So there's some little bit of diversity, but it's more pronounced in Belgium. But overall, the majority feel completely aligned with their gender as it is now. And then we asked them if they've ever felt that they were in love with a boy or a girl. And the majority of boys in South Africa felt yes, they would have ever been in love with a girl. And then around 5% of the sample of boys had said they had been in love with boys and girls, and 6% with a boy. And then among girls in South Africa who had been in love with a girl, it was almost 9%. And another notable finding would be that in girls in both countries, if you compare this boys and girls who have been in love with someone of the same gender, girls tend to have higher proportions than boys in both countries. But overall, South African girls had the highest proportion that had been in love with someone of the same gender, or someone both genders. And then the last time we were in love, was it with a girl or a boy? Again, here South African girls, 12.5% had been in love with a girl the last time. And again, girls always showing a higher proportion than boys in both countries of being expressing that they had felt in love with someone of the same gender. And the differences were significant, especially for if they have ever been in love with a boy or a girl, for this particular set of results here. So other sociodemographics were parents' education level. For the South African sample, the parents tended to have primary and secondary education. There was quite a bit of missing data, so we take this particular line with a grain of salt, but for those that responded in Belgium, the parents tended to be of a secondary and college and university, and the same was observed for mothers and fathers. And then with family composition, we wanted to know who is the person that most looks after the young adolescent. And in South Africa, it was the mother mostly for both boys and girls, and then the father and the grandparents. Whereas in Belgium, we observed mother and both parents. But this question was actually not asked in South African survey because there were some modifications that each country made to the questionnaire when it was implemented. So I think maybe the trend could be slightly different as well. So not to draw too many conclusions from that. We are back now to the gender norm scales, and hopefully I've also made my notes here to be able to explain it well without having to go back to the slides explaining what the different scales are. Let me just quickly retrieve that. Right. So when it comes to adolescent romantic expectations, these are the mean scores. So the mean score will be between 1 and 5, and where excuse me just a second, I mixed up my papers. I want to. The mean scores were between 1 and 5, and so below 3 is around 3 is more moderate endorsement of whatever the attitude is, and around above 3.5 is higher endorsement, and then below 3 is lower, a lower endorsement of that particular attitude, and I'll be explaining what that implies as I go through the results. So for adolescent romantic expectations, which is more around the standards for boys and girls regarding expectations, particularly in heterosexual relationships, boys in Belgium, especially Belgian adolescents in general, but especially boys, they more strongly endorsed these sort of equal standards for boys and girls in heterosexual relationships. And then for sexual double standards, well, for South Africa, this endorsement was still high for this sort of equal standards for boys and girls, but it was lower compared to Belgium in general, and the difference was significant. So for sexual double standards, it was surprising to us that early adolescents, particularly girls, early adolescents in South Africa and girls in both countries, as compared to boys, are more likely to endorse sexual double standards. And this suggested to us that girls might have internalized this less empowered position that, you know, characterizes the stereotypes about sexual relationships and the position of girls in them. And then with gender stereotypical traits, we observed that boys in both countries and adolescents in South Africa in general showed a stronger endorsement of these gender stereotypical traits, which is the attitudes that boys should be tough while girls should project more vulnerability, and yes, boys more widely accepted these prescribed personality traits, stereotypical personality traits. And then in terms of gender stereotypical roles, there was only moderate, this is more to, in general, there was only moderate to low endorsement of gender stereotypical roles, especially in Belgium. So it means that, with the exception maybe of South African boys, the young adolescents didn't endorse or normalize the unequal roles attached to men and women in terms of how to behave, breadwinning roles, promiscuity, submission. And then with gender stereotypical appearances, this was endorsed more strongly by South African youth, young adolescents, and very strong contrast with Belgian youth as well. And then lastly, for attitudes towards homosexuality, we observed moderate to low endorsements of negative attitudes towards homosexuality, with more tolerance, if you will, observed among Belgian girls. So as you can see, quite mixed and not very easy to predict results. I mean, the only pattern might be here, but otherwise quite mixed. So it was interesting for us to have to interpret them. But before I go to the discussion, additional variables that I talked about that were not scales, and so we looked at each variable separately and compared boys and girls again and the country outcomes. Variables such as, we grouped these as sanctions for challenging gender roles. So it's about conformity and non-conformity. And we observed that most of the young adolescents in both countries, and very much so in South Africa, agreed that boys should be able to show their feelings without fear of being teased, and agreed that boys and girls should be equally responsible for house chores. Whereas whether or not it's okay to tease a girl or a boy who acts like a girl who acts like a boy, or a boy who acts like a girl, most of the young adolescents didn't agree, because we saw quite low percentages of agreement compared to the other variables, and even less agreement among young adolescents in Belgium. And then when it comes to sexual norms, whose responsibility is it to prevent pregnancy? The percentage who agreed that it's the girl's responsibility, about 54% of South African girls agreed, compared to 49% of boys, even though this difference wasn't that significant, but about half of South African early adolescents agree with that statement, whereas only about between 20 and 27% of girls and boys in Belgium agreed with the statement. And then other stereotypical attitudes, that women who carry condoms are easy, a real man should have as many partners as he can, and so on. These were very much, had high endorsement among South African boys, and some were significantly different between South African boys and girls. And then quite low among Belgian adolescents. So again, a mixed bag of findings. So we assess that, a complex picture emerges as to the patterns for endorsing or not endorsing stereotypical attitudes, if I'm to generalize, everything around these gender norms and gender and sexual diversity. And there's also this difference between boys and girls normally in how they endorse the different attitudes, and sometimes girls would be more endorsing of certain attitudes like sexual double standards than boys, and boys often are the more endorsing of stereotypical attitudes, but sometimes girls score higher than boys. So in all, this progressive and stereotypical attitudes exist concurrently within the same gender, within the same country, within the same group of early adolescents in general. And if we have looked at the South African results, and we've seen that for many of these, they were really scoring high on endorsement of almost every scale, we chose to, talk about that and think about that a little bit more. And we wondered if there are more entrenched, stereotypical attitudes in South Africa, even though in terms of gender identity, sexual identity, or sexual, there is some diversity that, South African early adolescents showed. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide to explore some of the other findings related to this. And then we assessed different levels as a sort of adaptation of an ecological model, if you will, where we looked at different factors at the societal level and the community level and the individual level that might help us to explore this complex picture that we're seeing. And we know that there are educational efforts to promote gender equality in both countries. But it's interesting to note the evaluations of the educational approach in South Africa, mainly through the life orientation curriculum, which is meant to promote gender equality and teach about sexual and gender diversity and so on, that the implementation of it may not be as effective. And I had prepared a quote here that I'll just read to you from a 2015 evaluation by Schaeffer and McLeod of life orientation. And they said that in conclusion, life orientation remains a potentially valuable resource for working with young people in ways that are constructive and agentic rather than punitive and prohibitory, that encourage critical thinking rather than prescribe and constrain, and that challenge normative discourses that result in exclusionary, violent, and unequal practices. Sexualities education is similarly a potential space for young people to talk about their own desires and experiences, not only for generating awareness of how sexual practices may be shaped by inequalities and result in negative outcomes, but also for facilitating the appreciation of diverse sexualities and sexuality as positive. So this is a reflection on how, again, the educational efforts line up, but maybe implementation in the different countries is the issue. And then we also thought about, the way the socio-cultural environment, history, religion, tradition, the current tolerance levels, quote unquote, that and pre-existing ones that are there irrespective of these laws, right? And we highlighted the need for further research on the role of media in this whole concept as well. With the socio-cultural environment, some of the literature that was interesting to us was, for instance, and to show that really these attitudes can exist concurrently, these complex attitudes can exist concurrently within the same group of people and within the same gender or country. Again, in the case of South Africa, for example, reports from the HSRC, which was titled Progressive Prudes, a survey of attitudes towards homosexuality and gender nonconformity in South Africa, which surveyed, and is a nationally representative survey. And one of the interesting statistics that I think show this contrast is how 51% of the South Africans think gay people have the same rights, while 72% of the same sample still believe it's morally wrong. So this sort of conflicting feelings for some people also makes us understand, not just for South Africa, but even for the sample as a whole, that progressive and traditional attitudes can exist in one person and in a group of people. And then we, at the community and interpersonal level, we thought about the traditionalizing effect of peer pressure, especially on boys, and because we saw in our study how boys were more likely to endorse negative attitudes that sort of perpetuate gender inequalities. And for family composition and intergenerational transmission of ideology, although there was quite a bit of difference in the variables that were measured, especially the variable on mother and father raising the young adolescent. We already saw, for example, that a few more of the South African sample were raised by their grandparents. And so we are thinking about what the intergenerational relationships and the values that exist in the older generations being passed down to early adolescents as well. And then at the individual level, I think we saw so much the association with gender. One part of that is not part of our manuscript, but it was part of the broader analysis, was the role of age as well. But in that regression analysis, it really was gender and sex that were more associated with these different attitudes. And then we can also hypothesize about parents' educational level, where some literature suggests that highly educated and employed parents generally express more equitable gender attitudes. But all in all, clearly more research would need to be done to more directly link these different things together. But it gives us an idea of how attitudes, are distributed, if you will, in early adolescence in these specific environments in the two countries, and what more we might need to research to find out. So, as I just said, these results are not applicable to all youth in both countries. It's a sample of low-income communities, urban communities in one city in both countries. And attitudes, we know that attitudes develop and change over time as people interact with their environment and grow and get more awareness and so on. So because it's cross-sectional, we won't be able to see that evolution, and definitely a broad set of, like we mentioned media, for instance, but there's a broad set of sociodemographics that we can explore that we can help us make more definitive statements about what's the association between certain factors and the gender norms that are endorsed. So in conclusion, in both countries, although there were similar progressive legislative frameworks, there were differences in the gender norms and attitudes towards sexual and gender diversity among early adolescents. And so early adolescent attitudes may not always be aligned with the prevailing policies and legislative frameworks. Belgian early adolescents in general and girls in both countries tended to possess more progressive attitudes. However, some stereotypical norms still prevailed. and South African early adolescents more strongly expressed them. And there's a need for further research to understand the determinants of early adolescent attitudes and gender norms at different levels, from the individual to the societal. So that's my presentation today. Thank you very much. I'll be keen to hear thoughts and address any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mamothena. That was very interesting and a great presentation. I apologize for the noise in the background. I'm in the office and the generator is outside my office. So I hope that everyone can hear me. I would love to open the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask Mamothena? You can raise your hand or unmute. We've got a fairly small group, or pop something in the chat. Pancho, go ahead. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, good morning. I just wanted to ask, thank you so much. I missed your slide, perhaps the one where you showed the reliability of the scale. Can you just go back to that and comment on how reliable the scale was in this very diverse setting, obviously? And then a follow-up question is, yes, you say it's not representative, but what would you say about the notion of a representative sample when you're looking at something as contested as gender norms and attitudes? So even here in the UK, where I am, contestation and across different communities that track ethnic and religious lines. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I really didn't get the audio. Maybe someone who understood. I think something about the reliability of the scale, which I will share. I didn't share in this presentation.
Sorry, Pancho, we're struggling to hear you a little bit. Do you want to try again, or maybe pop your questions in the chat?
Is it a bit better now?
Oh, yes, that's much better. I can hear you. Mamothena, can you hear?
Yes, I just want to ask, please comment on the reliability of the tool in both settings, and what does it mean to have a representative sample, even though you didn't have it? Is that something that you want to aim with this particular research question, as we see that you know, different communities, especially here in the United Kingdom, have different receptions and different ways of understanding gender, and there's even been huge backlash against teaching of gender, what they call a gender ideology in schools. So does a representative sample even make sense here? And if not, what's the way forward?
Thank you. I hear you better now. I think a representative sample makes sense, and as I kept reiterating, these samples were limited to a very particular group of early adolescents, so they should always be interpreted in that sense. And also the limitation I mentioned on the broader, you know, samples characteristics being compared than just, you know, the parents' education level, for instance. So there's definitely a case for more research that is more representative, you know, and it would be nice to see the report, for instance, that I quoted around, that was done by the other foundation and the Human Sciences and Research Council of South Africa, that sort of nationally representative survey and study that can explain different attitudes based on different, you know, characteristics. But because our study was so small, it just describes for these particular groups. I wanted to share with you I'm gonna try and stop sharing this so I can share with you. I feared I wouldn't have time, so I didn't share the results of the exploratory factor analysis, but it's something that I can quickly share with you. I'm gonna retrieve my results, and then I'm gonna try and share that screen with you. It takes me a second to navigate Microsoft Teams, but it should be right. So I'm just gonna quickly look for But basically what we decided was if a scale has a Cronbach's alpha over 0.7, we would consider it good enough to use. So that's what we did. And in both countries, as you can see here, that's what it had, with the exception of this, which was close to it. So we kept it, but all of the scales in each country, they were based on our threshold of 0.7, highly reliable. I don't know if that answers your question regarding the EFA.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it does.
Okay, thanks very much. Does anyone else have any other questions that they would like to ask? You can raise your hand or unmute yourself or pop a question in the chat, I think. No? Okay, well, I have a question for you, Mamothena.
Okay.
But it's asking you to, I guess, think a little bit. Yeah, it's broader than just this presentation, but because it's ideas that we're thinking of around how to move this work forward, I guess. So I'm just wondering what your thinking is based on what we found in terms of the gender norms, particularly in the South African context. What you think that some of the findings may mean for sexual and reproductive health, given that that's what we're interested in that population for, and that's one of the key issues that we focused on in terms of this research. So I wonder if you have some thoughts, and I know that it's not necessarily something you've thought about. But,
no, I did. I mean, I did. I have a vested interest. I am a mother of a 12-year-old. I'm South African, so I have a vested interest in, not just as a researcher, but personally in this. But like I said, and it goes back to, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person who just asked me the question. But it goes back to their point about, different people having different ideas about gender and how these issues should be discussed, and so on. And my thinking has always been that just like we talk about the representative sample, it's nice to know these attitudes across different types of people, even within the same country, instead of generalizing all adolescents and having a one-size-fits-all sort of approach for them. So I guess the big question would be, how do we have enough of an intersectional lens to know how to adapt uptake of these educational programs within different micro contexts, and then make sure still that certain particular outcomes around gender equality are still reached. So for me, that's the big lingering question, and I'll be interested to hear what it makes them think of in terms of how do you move this sort of work forward. But that's my take, Lucia.
Thanks, Mamothena. And I think for me, the issues around that you've already raised around LO, but thinking more broadly in terms of comprehensive sexuality education are really interesting, and how we could maybe think about using our results to inform some of that. Does anyone else have any other questions that they would like to ask, or comments that they have? Nope. Mamothena, do you have anything else that you want to add? I mean, one of the things that has struck me and that you mentioned already is around socioeconomic status and some of the issues that we came up against in terms of the analysis not having many indicators to refer to, and that parent education indicator for me is really interesting. And I do think that one of the things that we should be thinking about in terms of future research is how we kind of unpack that. And I think you've noted that already, but I think that still is a really interesting finding, and I guess a little bit of a limitation in terms of the data that we have. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Mamothena?
No, I agree with you around the education, and I'm seeing a hand also.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, but yeah, I agree with you around the education, and I don't know if it's because younger people just don't know how much schooling their parents have done, but these are some of the things that are very important to get to use effective strategies for getting answers to some of these questions, so that this sort of um, analysis can be done more effectively in the future.
Yeah. Pancho, you've got a hand up. You can go ahead.
Yes, just as a follow-up, thank you so much. What would you then say, Mamothena, if policymakers said, well, because we've done the survey in this community, they don't like these ideas of, homosexuality. We won't keep it in the curriculum, so we're going to have a different comprehensive sexual CSO curricula depending on the area of the country. Because that's, I think, what is being considered in some contexts, perhaps even here in the UK.
Sorry, so your question is, are you asking if then it's a good idea to have different curricula for different people?
Well, yes, I'm saying, for those who, because, we are sort of preaching to the choir here, but those who are, not in these spaces, public health spaces, have very serious reservations and they don't want these CSO curricula. So perhaps can they use these data in a sort of subversive way? If you were to do this in another micro community.
Okay, and then they say, you see, sort of to use it to endorse that, nobody wants.
Precisely, yes.
Certain norms persist, then we shouldn't try. But I think overall, the overarching value in South Africa, at least, and with Belgium and many countries, is how these different attitudes, whether or not they exist right now, they do have certain ripple effects. They do affect gender relations and gender equality and certain outcomes in a very particular way. And in the interest of equality, in the interest of better well-being for everyone and health, I mean, it's sort of the mandate of a country that endorses a constitution based on equality to then find ways to deal with these things, right? And not just, we can't just constantly be addressing gender-based violence when it's already happened and someone is at the police station or at the hospital. This is more around root causes and attitudes of people, and addressing that before it becomes an action, if you will. So I think, yeah, there's always potential to be subversive about these things, but that would be something that goes against the ethos of, certain nations like South Africa, and that's something that can be, I think, advocated against, because it just would go against the law, I guess, for a decision maker. The question for me is how to go about it, how to go about making sure that you address gender inequality. It's not about whether we want gender equality or not. We've already agreed that we want it. So then how do we do it, and how do we tailor, how do we have one overarching value and one overarching goal, and how do we achieve the overarching goal of gender equality? It's the details, the devil is in the details, if you will, in how we get the message across, but the goal should be the same, and the problem is the same, and the outcome, the desired outcome, is the same. So the details in the middle of how do you do it is where the policy conversations need to happen. But saying that, we should keep the existing norms, that just goes against everything, and is something to be advocated against, just based on the values and the constitution and the laws that the country have agreed on of equality, and ensuring health and well-being. it's a very roundabout comment, but I hope that it shows you my view on this thing. It's just my view, really.
Thanks, Mamothena, and thanks, Pancho, for the question. I think that it's a good place to leave it. I think that that's what we're hoping that this data will do, is to inform some of those potential future policies and have some impact. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. It was a good session. I'm sorry that it was a slightly smaller session than usual, I think because of load shedding here. But I hope everybody has a lovely afternoon. And thank you very much again, Mamothena, for the presentation. It was really fantastic. And I think those of us that were here enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.